but it is, of course, a tour to sort of wrap up, at least Israel time, wrap up the fast. Now, ordinarily on Tisha B'Av, the idea of doing a tiyul, of doing a hike, a real one, a real tour, not a virtual one, first of all, wouldn't be advisable because of the heat and everyone's fasting. But also, perhaps it might seem incongruous. This is a day of avelut. This is a day of mourning. It's not a time that we normally associate with taking trips. However, the type of tour that we're about to do, if logistically it would be possible to do in person, might even be appropriate. This morning in the keynote, we read a beautiful poem from Rabbi Yehuda Levi, one of the keynote this morning, Tzion Halot Tishali Lishlom Asirayich. And Rabbi Yehuda Levi sitting in Spain, dreaming about the land of Israel and mourning the fact that he was in exile. One of the things he imagines, he said, Mi yitneini mishotet bimkomot asher neglu Elohim lechozayich v'tzirayich. If only I could walk around in the places where God has revealed himself to his prophets, meaning, of course, Yerushalayim. And if I would even walk barefoot and naked just if I could walk among the ruins where your temple once stood. So it seems that to a certain extent, doing a tour on Tisha B'Av actually would be appropriate. Again, even if this wasn't Corona times, we probably wouldn't be out walking in the sun right now. But what I'd like to do today is to take a virtual tour with the use primarily of a number of videos. Basically, I did this tour a few weeks ago with the help of my daughter, Batsheva Haber, who was my camera person. We made some amateur quality videos. And let me get started right away by showing you where we're going to be going. Oops, that's the wrong window. Okay. This is what we'll be doing in the next hour or so. You see on this Google map, it's actually about a 30-minute walk, so this will be more or less in real time. I don't know how familiar everyone is here with contemporary Jerusalem, but let me just show you the map. And of course, there's reasons that we're going to these specific places. I'll explain. But this here is the old city. This is the Shar Yafo, the Jaffa Gate, Shar Tzion. This is the western wall, the Kol Ma'aravi over here. We're going to be starting right over here. This is this street here is called Derech Hebron. And it's a street that comes up from the southern part of Yerushalayim towards the old city. This is the first station, once was a train station, today entertainment complex. We're going to be starting here, and we'll travel all the way over here, and we'll wind up near where it says here, Yad Avshalom's tomb. What that actually is, we'll talk about when we get there. So that's the plan, and this is where we're. One moment, please. And this is where we're starting. A little bit of more close-up view. And before we get into why we're going here and what I hope we can learn and take from all this, let me show you the first video, kind of to set the stage. Okay, one moment. I need to now set up the video. Every time I switch, I need to do this. One moment, please. Okay. So let's start the tour. Okay, we're standing here right on top of a street known as Derech Hebron. Behind me here is or actually up in that direction, is the old train station of Jerusalem, the Khan Theater. This is Rehov Keren HaYesod, for those familiar with modern Jerusalem. And we're standing on the threshold between New Yerushalayim, New Jerusalem, and Old Jerusalem. Before the Six-Day War in 1967, this was the border between Israel and the enemy, Jordan. There was barbed wire here, just over the other side of this street. And this sculpture was put here in the year 1966 by Israeli artist Yigal Tumarkin. On the sculpture are words from the Navi Yeshayahu, the prophet Isaiah, words that were originally spoken just over there in the city of Yerushalayim. The famous prophecy, "V'chitetu charbotam le'itim v'chanitoteim lemazmerot." They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev v'lo yilmedu od milchama. That nation shall not lift up sword unto nation. They shall not learn war anymore. And the artist, perhaps expressing a hope that we could fulfill this prophecy in our own day, placed the verses from the Bible both in Hebrew and in Arabic, so that maybe the people on the other side could understand. And he made an artistic representation here with pieces of old weapons and pieces of old farm equipment, representing the swords hoping to be beaten into plowshares. 50 years later, we're still waiting for the full fulfillment of this vision, but we do today have a united Yerushalayim, and we're going to be able to cross what was once the border. We're going to walk across this bridge. Behind me over here, you see the walls of Yerushalayim, the old city of Yerushalayim. Those are not the same walls we read about in the Tanakh, in the Bible. They're not the walls from the days of the first or second temples, because the walls of Yerushalayim were destroyed and rebuilt many times. They're not even exactly in the same place as the original walls, but those are the walls of Yerushalayim. Today's Jerusalem is a metropolis, many, many times the size of the old city, but in its heart lies the ancient city, 4,000 years of history behind those walls. And those walls were a source of longing for Jews throughout the ages. Wherever Jews were in the world, anywhere in the exile, they dreamed of returning to the walls of Yerushalayim. In the synagogues, before taking out the Torah, they sang the pasuk, Tivneh Chomot Yerushalayim. They dreamed and prayed for rebuilding the walls of Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is a city that's built on a series of hills, and 3 hills surrounded by very deep valleys. On this side, on the western side, you have a valley called Gei Ben Hinnom, and on the other side, on the eastern side, Nachal Kidron. We're going to walk down into those valleys beneath the walls of Yerushalayim in order to uncover the secrets,
time to begin, yes?
Stories that are hidden in those valleys. Come with me.
Time to begin.
Ezra, can you mute people, please? Okay, we're standing here. All right. I need to, one moment. In between the videos, I need to do this. Okay. As we're walking down into the valley, let's talk about what we're going to see down there and what it has to do with Tisha B'Av. There's a well-known comment made by the rabbis in the Talmud, Masechet Yoma Daf Tet Amud Bet. The rabbis tried to figure out what was the problem, what were the sins, what was the spiritual, moral failings that led to the destruction of the 2 temples, the 2 Batei Mikdash. And they came to the following conclusion. Mikdash Rishon, the first temple, Mipnei Macharev, Mipnei Shlosha Dvarim Shayu Bo, 3 sins that were there, Avodah Zarah, V'Giloi Arayot, V'Shfichut Damim, idol worship, incest and adultery, and murder. Aval mikdash sheni, but the second temple, shayu oskim b'torah u'v'mitzvot v'gmilut chasadim. When it came to the second temple, the people were doing much better when it came to those types of things. Instead of those horrible sins, they were involved with the study of Torah and performance of mitzvot and acts of kindness. So why was the second temple, destroyed? Mipnei shahitabo sinat chinam. Because there was sinat chinam, there was baseless hatred. Lamedcha, and that's to teach you, sheshkula sinat chinam keneged shalosh averot avodah zarah giloy harayot v'shfichut damim. That's to teach you that baseless hatred, sinat chinam, is as severe an offense as those three sins are. This is a fairly well-known Gemara. And ordinarily, when people talk about this nowadays, I think the tendency is to focus primarily on the sin of sinat chinam. There's lots and lots of talk about sinat chinam nowadays, and for very good reasons. First of all, because the exile that we're still in the process of returning from, and the destruction that we're still mourning and trying to rebuild, is this second destruction. And therefore, the sin, so to speak, that we need to work on today, apparently, is sinat chinam. And I think that's true. But I also think there's another reason. Because today, in today's tour, we're not going to focus on sinat chinam. If we have a few minutes, I'll say a few words about it. In connection with the first Beit HaMikdash, the avodah zarah, giloy harayot, and shfichut damim. These sins, first of all, it's these are the worst sins in the Torah, right? These are the three offenses for which we're told yeh hareg v'al ya'avor. The only three things under normal circumstances where a person, God forbid, is faced with a choice between violating the Torah and or risking losing their life. We know that pikuach nefesh takes precedence over virtually everything. The only three exceptions to that under normal circumstances are these three, we can call them cardinal sins of idolatry, of sexual immorality, and of murder. And Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, even interestingly enough, categorized them. He said that each of these three cardinal sins is the absolute worst offense that a person could commit in the three main categories of responsibilities that people have. Ben Adam Lamakom, between man and God, what's the worst offense that a person could commit to God? Is worshiping foreign gods, avodah zarah. Ben Adam Lechavero, between man and man, what's the worst? And fascinatingly, he put the third offense here, Giluy Arayot, incest and adultery and related matters. He put that as the worst offense a person could commit, Bein Adam le'atzmo, debasing one's own self and violating one's responsibilities to oneself. So in any case, we know that those are not supposed to commit. And the statement, therefore, that our rabbis accuse our ancestors at the time of the first Beit HaMikdash of being guilty, reason that we're going to go down into the valleys and see what we can see there. There are some things we can see there and some texts we can read there that I hope will help us get a deeper insight into how it's possible that our ancestors degenerated to such depths. But I just want to make one other point before we start. You see, going back to what I said a minute ago, that nowadays people like to speak about sinat chinam and not about these things. I don't think the only reason is because of the assumption that the things we need to work on now are connected with sinat chinam. I think there's another reason. Speaking about sinat chinam in our society is very understandable. It's not easy to fight the phenomenon, but it's very easy to explain to people that baseless hatred is a bad thing. When you look at these three sins, that's certainly true when it comes to shfichut damim. I think our society today understands very well that murder is a very, very, very serious offense, one of the most serious offenses possible. However, when it comes to the other two of these cardinal sins, avodah zarah, idolatry, and giloy arayot, I think people nowadays have a very hard time relating to these things as offenses in any sense, let alone as severe ones. Because when it comes to these two areas, religion and sexual behavior, in our society today, these are very much considered things which are very much up to the individual person. We feel very uncomfortable even criticizing a person for exercising their true religious beliefs, whatever that may be. And as long as there's no abuse, God forbid, or coercion involved, if we're dealing with consenting adults, criticizing people for their sexual behavior also is something that we feel very uncomfortable with. We look at those two areas, religion and sexuality, as very private, personal matters that are up to each person to decide. And therefore, declaring these things as sins, let alone as severe sins, and let alone blaming national tragedies on them, is something that's a modern or postmodern ear is very, very difficult to swallow. And I think that also might be the reason that we steer away from discussing these things. But I want to actually discuss them for those very reasons, because I think that we can address that issue as well as understand how it's possible that we violated these sins, and I think there's a lot to learn from it. So here's where we started. We started over here. This is the bridge we walked across, and we're descending down now into the valley next to the Jerusalem Cinematheque, down below till here. Up here would be the walls, or actually up here would be the walls of the old city. And now I want to show you another video that I made in this valley below. I'm standing now in the valley called Gay Ben Hinnom, or Gay Hinnom, the Hinnom Valley in English. Gay Hinnom. That name later on in history, this valley is mentioned in Tanakh in a number of places. Later on in history, the name Gay Hinnom, or perhaps you're more familiar with it with a slightly different pronunciation, Gehenna, became associated with a horrific concept. When we say Gehenna, we're referring to hell. We're referring to the concept of a place or a state of being where evil, wicked people are punished in eternity for their sins. If you look at this place, it's actually a very beautiful valley. Certainly today, up here above me, first of all around you see grass and trees. Up there is what's called Brechat Sultan, the Sultan's Pool. They have shows and concerts there. Further up, Chutzot HaYotzer, the place where there's arts and crafts and all sorts of other things. Over here, just below the hill, is a music center. There's a park where you see people having picnics. There's a guy with a horse over here. Just above me is the Jerusalem Cinematheque. This does not look like a very hellish place at all. How did this beautiful valley beneath the walls of the Yerushalayim, how did the name Gehenna, which is the name of this valley, become associated with such a horrific concept? If you look in the book of Bayit, it tells us that in this valley, 2,800 years ago, 2,800 years ago, this was a site of all sorts of idolatry. People used to come here to worship foreign gods. Even the kings of Yehudah, some of them came down here to worship foreign gods. And particularly, a particular idol that was worshipped here in this valley was Molech, a particularly horrific form of idolatry where people sacrificed their own children to this god. According to the book of Divrei Hayamim, at least two kings of Yehudah, Achaz Melech Yehudah and Menashe Melech Yehudah, burnt their own sons in fire in worship of this horrific idolatry called Molech. And towards the end, just before the destruction of the first temple, the prophet Yirmiyahu stood somewhere above us here, and he gave the following prophecy. Ki asu v'nei Yehuda hara be'einai ne'um Adonai. Samu shikutzehem babayit asher nikra shmi alav l'tamo. God is angry at the people who placed idolatry in the temple. Uvanu bamot hatofet asher begay veninnom. And they built the altars to this god Molech, which was also called Tophet, here in this valley, lisrofet b'neihem ve'benotehem ba'esh, asher lo tziviti v'lo alta libi, something that I never would have wanted. Lachein hinei yamim ba'im nu Adonai, v'lo ye'amer od hatofet v'gei ben Hinnom. One day this valley will no longer be called the place of Tophet, the place of worship. Gei ben Hinnom, ki imgei ha'harega. This is going to be a place of death, a place of graves where the residents of Jerusalem are going to be slaughtered and are going to be buried because of the sins that were committed here. And we have evidence that later on during the destruction of the first temple, indeed many Jews from Rishon were taken down here and slaughtered in order perhaps to fulfill this horrific prophecy. So we see that Gei Hinnom unfortunately became a place that today, thank God, seems to have been redeemed as part of Yerushalayim coming back to life. But this was once a place of death and a place where really horrific things took place. The tragedy that Jewish people could come down here and sacrifice their children in the name of some twisted religion is that over 1,000 years before those kings engaged in this worship here, just over the hill, on the mountain on the other side, the mountain called Har Moriah, our ancestor Abraham, who had been commanded to bring his son to Akedat Yitzchak, and as he lifted his knife to show his complete devotion and willingness to fulfill the word of God, over 1,000 years before these events, a voice came down from Shamayim that said, Al tishlach yadcha el anar. This is not what God wants, and that's what Yirmiyahu was echoing. Tragically, the message wasn't heard back in those days. And unfortunately, even today, the city of Yerushalayim has seen people who, in a twisted belief of what God wants, have been willing to send their children to blow themselves up in evil terrorist attacks, screaming, Allahu Akbar, God is great. Unfortunately, there are still people who think that God wants human sacrifice. The message of Gei Harega still hasn't fully worked. Is documented very clearly in the Tanakh, worship this idolatry called Molech. There are those who, the Rambam is of the opinion that they didn't actually kill the children in Molech, although the Rambam acknowledges that human sacrifice was done to other gods, and it certainly seems, based on what we're based on the Psukim in Yirmiyahu, he says clearly the Srofet b'neihem v'benotehem b'eish. Try to understand that. What could bring a parent, what religious idea could bring a parent to take their own child with their own hands and sacrifice to whatever god or deity they believe in? Yirmiyahu also mentioned the word tophet. In modern Hebrew, coming from this pasuk, the word tophet means some kind of a booby trap or terrorist attacks are often associated with the word tophet. Ezra, if you can mute everyone again, please. I want to show you a rabbinic midrash that tries to understand this issue a little bit better, both in terms of understanding the names Gei ben Hinnom and Tophet, and more importantly, which tries to help us understand, I think, how parents could be brought to do this. So this midrash is actually commenting on the verse that we just read, the verse in Jeremiah. Uvanu bamot hatofet asher begei ben Hinnom amru raboteinu zal af al pi shahayu kol batei elilim b'Yerushalayim hamolech haya michutz liYerushalayim b'makom muflag. The Midrash comments that we know from the Navi that they had temples to all sorts of idolatry in the city of Jerusalem itself. But when it came to the worship of Molech, they went outside the city to Gei ben Hinnom, where the video we were just standing. And the Midrash tries to imagine, I don't know to what extent this is a historical description and to what extent this is a Midrashic imagination, but in either way, I think it contains deep insight. Keitzad haya asui, what did this temple look like where they worshiped Molech, this place called Tophet? Hayat Selem, there was a statue, it was an idol. Vayalo sheva kankalim, it had 7 enclosures around it, one inside the other. V'hu lifnim mehem, there were 7 fences or barriers, one inside the next, and only at the inside of all 7 was the god, the Molech. Vayu panav shel egel, its face was the face of a calf. V'yadav pshutot, and it had outstretched hands. Ke'adam shepotech yadav l'kabel mechavero, like a person who wanted to receive something from a friend. Vayu mesikim oto bifnim, it was hollow, it was made out of metal, and they would burn a fire inside the idol. Shayach halul, it was hollow. V'chol adam ve'adam lefi korbano nichnas. And when you came to worship this god, you would be allowed to enter the various partitions according to the sacrifice that you brought. Keitzad, how does this work? Kol mi shehaya lo of, if somebody comes with a bird, a small sacrifice, haya nichnas lekankal Rishon umakriv, he was allowed to enter the first partition and he would bring his sacrifice there. Son, if he was coming with a sheep, lasheni, sel lashlishi, if it was a goat, he got to enter the third. Egel l'revi'i, a calf, he would enter the fourth partition. Par lachamishi, if it's a bull, he would enter the fifth. Shor lashishi, and if he's bringing an ox, he can enter even the sixth partition. And I'll pause here for a moment before going on to just comment what's going on here. Why is it that depending which animal you bring, you get to enter closer to the idol? And it depends on what? It depends on the size of the animal. What's the concept here? The concept here is that depending on the value of what you're bringing, someone who's bringing a bird, so the more you're bringing, the closer you get to come. But contrast that with the mitzvot in the Torah. A number of the korbanot in the Torah are called korban olev yored. Certain types of sins, if you commit them, you bring what's called a korban olev yored, which means that you're supposed to bring a sheep. But the Torah says if you can't afford a sheep, then you're allowed instead to bring a bird. If you can't afford a bird, you're really poor, you're allowed to bring grain. And in fact, when it comes to grain, flour is the cheapest, most inexpensive of the korbanot. And the comment is often made in Parshat Vayikra. When it discusses the sacrifices, the offerings that are brought of grain, it says nefesh ki yakriv mikem. When a person comes to bring a mincha, that's usually a poor person who's bringing his own soul. It could very well be that the poor person who scraped together a few pennies to buy a little bit of flour is doing something that's more precious in God's eyes than someone that brings a fancy, expensive bull, because if that person is very wealthy, it's no big deal. So our God, the true God, values a person's sincerity, but not the idolatry. The idol, or the way these people conceived of it, it doesn't care. It's not impressed with how hard you work. What counts is the results. Doesn't matter that a poor person scraped together everything and is bringing with his meager resources a small bird. That person is told, okay, we'll let you stand on the outskirts and do something. But the wealthy person who's coming with a bull, he gets to come inside. Because in an idolatrous conception of what a God is, the God is selfish and the God is concerned with itself, just like people are concerned with themselves. So depending on what you bring, you get to go in. And someone who brings a fancy ox gets to go into the sixth partition. But there's one more partition in between, even closer. Who gets to go even closer than someone who brings an ox? Mi shahaya makriv bino, someone who was bringing his child. Hayu machnisino tov hashvi'i. He would go into the seventh partition. V'hu noshko, and he could even kiss the idol. V'alzen ne'amar, connects it with a pasuk in Hosea. Zovchei adam agalim yishkun. There you sacrifice people, kiss the calf. So this person would come in with his child and present it in front of the idol. And the priest would get the fire going really strong inside the idol Ad shayu yadav nasod ke'ur, until the hands of the idol that were made out of metal would be scalding hot. V'notlin et hatinok, and they would take the child, v'notnin oto l'toch yadav, and place it into the hands of this idol, into the fire. Vayu mevi'im tupim, umikashkeshim behem bekol gavoa, and then they would bring drums and start beating on the drums very loudly, kedei shelo yehei kolo shel na'ar yotzei, so that the father who just brought his own child and sacrificed him to this god wouldn't hear the screams of his baby. Umeyav homim alav, v'lama nikra shemo Ben Hinnom, and according to this midrash, why was this valley called the Valley of Ben Hinnom? Shekolo shel tinok haya nohem mikoach ha'esh. The word nohem in Hebrew means to moan or to wail, and the child would cry, and it's the valley of crying, Gay Ben Hinnom. And Rashi also tells us that the word tofet, which is the other name for this, comes from the word tof, from the drums that they would beat, so that the father and the mother perhaps wouldn't hear the cries of the baby who was being sacrificed. It's a horrific, horrific image. Really, 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 really terrifying. But again, the Navi tells us that our ancestors, including at least two of the kings, actually did this. They brought their children and sacrificed them. What could possibly bring a parent to take their own child and sacrifice it? I think it goes back to who gets to go into those first 6 partitions, and to the way that a person who worships idolatry views the world. See, the difference between monotheism and paganism is not just numerical. Well, they have many gods and we have only one. No, it's a fundamentally different conception. Because if there's Ezra, please mute. If there's not one God, if there are many gods, that means that there's no one in charge. When there's one God, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, it means that the universe has a ruler. It means that someone's in charge, and that this world has a purpose, that this world was designed for a reason, is being run for a reason. If you are believing in multiple gods, polytheism and atheism are actually not that different from one another, even though they might seem the opposite. An atheist sees the world as a place where nobody's in charge. It's a chaotic place where different forces, and that's where the atheist calls them forces and the polytheist calls them gods, but they're, whatever they are, they're powers that struggle with one another. There is no real value to anything. And the gods are basically just like people. The gods are concerned for themselves and they're selfish. And whoever gives them something more valuable, they'll treat that person better. What's more valuable even than a fat ox? A person who brings their own child, a human being, to sacrifice to the god. And whether it's out of some sense of desire for some sort of power, or whether it's out of fear and terror that the God, that if I don't do this, the God is going to be angry with me. If I do this, perhaps I'll be spared. This is what happens when a person believes in idolatry. And so we see, and I'm going back now already to begin to address the point I made earlier. Today we understand what's wrong with murder, but what's wrong with religious freedom and stuff like that? We see here that idolatry can very easily lead to murder. I'm going to develop this theme a little bit further, so let's go on. Okay, so we are now going to continue. Let me just show you now. So here is where we are now. We're going to be walking. This is the old city wall. Okay, this is Shar Tzion, the gate that goes into the Jewish quarter. This is Shar HaShpot, the gate that goes towards the Kotel. This is the Kotel HaMaravi. And our walk is going to take us through Gay Ben Hinnom here, down to this area where I'm going to show you the next video. Basically, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you 3 videos in fairly quick succession. This one is right here, just below the hill that at the top of which is the Bayit, near what's called the city of David. And then we're going to continue further up the valley. This is already Nachal Kidron, until we get to this area called Yad Avshalom, Avshalom's tomb, which again, when we get there, we'll see that it's not actually Yad Avshalom, but that's what it's called. Okay, so I'm going to show you first two videos that I made along the walk, and then we'll start moving up towards Yad Avshalom. Give me just a second to reset this. We've walked a bit. We walked down Gay Ben Hinnom. Just at the bottom of this street here is the meeting point between two valleys. Gay Ben Hinnom that comes around this way, and Nachal Kidron, where we're standing now, that goes up that way. We're now to the south of the old city, and this valley, Nachal Kidron, hooks around the old city on its eastern side. Behind me is what's known as Ir David, the oldest part of Yerushalayim, and we are standing at the very bottom of Ir David. Just behind this wall here is what's called Brechat HaShiloach, the Shiloach pool, the pool that was first built by Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, that brought the water through the famous tunnel that he dug inside the city walls. That pool, which was the main water source of Yerushalayim throughout the end of the first temple period and the second temple period that followed, it was from this pool in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash that they used to bring the water up to the Beit HaMikdash on Sukkot for the Simchat Beit HaSho'eva, the ceremony of dancing and singing and celebrating before the water was poured on the Mizbeach on the altar. All the way above us on top of the hill, you could just see the walls of Yerushalayim, today's walls, and behind those walls is the Kotel HaMaravi, the western wall, and the Temple Mount, the Har HaBayit. We're going to continue walking now up Nachal Kidron to see some ancient sites that are there. Okay, so now we walked up a bit. We're now in the second valley to the east of the old city. This is Nachal Kidron, and I'm making here I'm going to give another little explanation here at the entrance to this valley. I'm standing now on a path that leads towards the upper part of Nachal Kidron. We are at the eastern side of Yerushalayim. Up here is the top of Ir David. Just up there, you could see the very corner of the old city wall. That's the corner of the Temple Mount. That's the southeastern corner of the Har HaBayit. So up on this side is the city of Yerushalayim. And the steep hill up here is Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives. This valley, I told you, is called Nachal Kidron, but it also has other names. It's also known as Emek HaMelech. Emek HaMelech is a term that appears in the book of Bereshit, the King's Valley. It's the place where Melchizedek Melech Shalem, the ancient king of Jerusalem at the time of Avraham Avinu, came to greet Avraham when he returned victorious from battle. Melchizedek was a righteous man. His name means king of justice. And he was a Kohen Le'el Elyon. He was one of the few people in the world at that time who seems to have been influenced by Abraham's message and understood the true God. Later, so this place is Emek HaMelech, and it's Nachal Kidron. Later in history, this valley came to be associated also with another name, Emek Yehoshaphat. Now that name comes from the book of Yoel. The prophet Joel, has a horrific prophecy of what's going to happen at the end of days. When I shall bring the Jewish people back from exile, I shall bring them to the valley. I will gather all the nations of the world and bring them to the valley of Yehoshaphat. Yehoshaphat means justice of God, God's justice. V'nishpatati mamsham alami v'nachalati Yisrael. And it talks about a final judgment where all the nations will come and be punished for all of their sins. Now, it's not clear when the Navi Yoel spoke about the valley of Yehoshaphat, it's not at all clear where that valley is, or even if that valley is a physical place. Some of the commentators understand it just as a metaphor. But for some reason, at some point, maybe in the time of the Talmud or afterwards, this valley came to be associated by that name. So much so that the local Arabs to this day call it Wadi Joz, the part that's above us here. So this is Emek HaMelech, Emek Yehoshaphat. And this valley on the hills coming down from Yerushalayim on one side, and the hills sloping up to Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives, on the other, has been since ancient times a place of burial. There are burial caves here that go back to the first temple period. We're going to see a little further up graves of Jews from the second temple period. We're going to see some very, very large monuments. It's for that reason that we came here. And more recently as well, this is a place of burial. Certainly from the Middle Ages and on this hill here, there's some old graves. Just over here is the grave of Rabbi Ovadia Mibar Tanura, the great commentator of the Mishnah, who lived in Italy in the 16th century and came towards the end of his life to Yerushalayim and is buried here. And just above me here is the Jewish cemetery on Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives, which from the 15th or 16th century on, all the way up to the 20th century, over 120,000 Jewish graves are there. And perhaps to some extent that's connected with the idea of Emek Yehoshaphat, the idea that this is the place of final judgment. There are all sorts of traditions that Tchiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead, will begin here. So this area, beneath the Temple Mount and the walls of Yerushalayim, and the Mount of Olives that's opposite it, is a place, one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries. And we came to see a few of the monumental graves that are here. So we're going to walk up this way and we'll go see them. Okay. I'm going to take you now a little bit further up and show you one more video, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So we've walked even further now. We're very close to Yad Avshalom, to the end of the tour. And let's watch this third video, and then we'll talk about it. We're standing now beneath the walls of the Temple Mount. That's the Har HaBayit up there. That's the eastern wall of the Har HaBayit, the eastern wall of the old city. This is the upper part of Nachal Kidron, Emek HaMelech, Emek Yehoshaphat. Up here you see, carved into the mountain, a monumental tomb for the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. There's an inscription on the top that says that this is the tomb of Bnei Chezir, a family of Kohanim that worked in the temple. We know about them. They're mentioned even in the book of Divrei Hayamim. And next to this tomb, we have an even more impressive, what appears to be a structure of a tomb. The tradition says that this is the tomb of Zechariah ben Yehoyada. Zechariah ben Yehoyada was a Kohen who worked in the first Beit HaMikdash, who was murdered in the Beit HaMikdash by Jews because he tried to rebuke them for the sin of Avodah Zarah. He was murdered on Yom Kippur. This is described in the book of Melachim and also in the book of Divrei Hayamim. That terrible, tragic event was seen by the rabbis as one of the key events that led to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash a few hundred years later. And according to the tradition, this is his kever, this is his grave. However, there's a problem with the tradition because it can't possibly be his grave for two reasons. Most importantly, because from the style of the building, it's very, very clear that what we're looking at is something that was built in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, some 800 or 900 years later. We're talking here about a monumental structure that is a monolith. That means it was carved into the rock by hand. That's all something that was once part of the mountain that was carved out of the mountain by hand. And if you look at the style, those are familiar with classical architecture. You see here imaginary pillars. Those aren't actual pillars. They're not holding anything up. But they're pillars as if it's the front of a building with ionic capitals on top of them. And on top of that, you have a pyramid structure called a nefesh. This reflects a style that was very common at that time. Monumental burial tombs had two parts. They had a lower part, which was a burial cave itself, a structure where the actual burial took place. And on top of that, they had this pyramid-shaped structure, which was called a nefesh. And it was meant to represent the body and the soul, which were together during life and separated during death, the body at the bottom and the nefesh, which means soul, at the top. So this is a style that can't possibly be from the time of Zechariah ben Yehoyada, the first Beit HaMikdash. This is a style that was in place, or that was common at the very end of the second Beit HaMikdash. But there's something else. Archaeological excavations were done here in the 1960s, and it turns out that there is no grave here at all. This is carved into the natural mountain. It's carved out of the mountain, and there's no cave. Underneath there's no entrance to a burial cave whatsoever. So this is not a grave at all. It's a monument. Somebody spent an enormous amount of time and money carving this huge structure as a monument to someone's grave, and nobody knows whose it is. And therefore, there is one possibility. One of the theories that's been suggested is that maybe, in fact, this is meant to be a monument to Zechariah ben Yehoyada. Perhaps there was a tradition that this is where he was buried, or somewhere in this area, and that so many hundreds of years later, the Jews in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash chose to make this monument in his memory. There are other possibilities too, and we may never know. But traditionally, this incredible structure is known as the tomb of Zechariah ben Yehoyada. Okay. So first of all, just so it's clear, right, that incredible thing, it looks like a tomb, it looks like a grave. We know of graves that were built that way, and we'll see another one in a moment when we get to Yad Avshalom. That's not a grave. It's just solid rock. It's the natural mountain carved out, and it's just solid rock. So we don't know, but the tradition throughout all the ages was that this is the grave of Zechariah ben Yehoyada. It's not his grave, but it's not, and it was made many centuries later, but it's not anyone else's grave either. It's a marker for somebody's grave, and therefore maybe it is the grave. Maybe it's meant to mark the grave of Zechariah ben Yehoyada, or maybe it was something else. We don't know. But either way, we need to ask ourselves the following question, because if that is the case, Jews, if that really was built as a monument to Zechariah ben Yehoyada as the tradition, 600 years later, Jews spent all of that time and effort and money creating this monument to him. And even if it was actually built for somebody else, he was considered important enough that later on they associated such an impressive monument with him. Who is Zechariah ben Yehoyada? Why was he so important? Why was he murdered? And why was his murder such a tragic thing? Oh, I did it again. 1 second. I apologize. Okay. I'm not sure this is working properly. Okay. Okay. The background to this story, very quickly, is that there was a king named Achav. Achav, one of the most evil kings described in the Tanakh, a king of the northern kingdom of Yisrael, who made an alliance through marriage also with the kings of Yehuda. And there was a woman whose name was Atalia. According to one understanding, she was his Achav's sister. According to another understanding, she was his daughter. But in either case, she was certainly a relative of Achav. And after Achav was overthrown by Yehu ben Nimshi, and both the king of Yisrael and the king of, not Achav, Achav's son was killed, and also the king of Yehuda, his ally, Achazia Melech Yehuda, was also killed. His wife, Atalia, who again was a relative of Achav, decided that she was going to seize the throne. In order to do that, she killed any male descendants of David who could have been a king, which means she killed a number of her own descendants, her children and grandchildren, and wiped out almost everybody. And she assumed the throne, and she was also a very evil person, and also brought lots of idolatry into the land. However, there was one baby, Yoash, who was saved from Atalia by his aunt, Yehosheva, who it just so happens was married to the Kohen Gadol of the time, Yehoyada. Okay, so the Kohen Gadol's wife was also a relative of the king's, and she saved her nephew, who was a baby, and they hid the baby in the Beit HaMikdash, raised this baby in the Beit HaMikdash until he was 7 years old, which I guess they felt was the youngest possible age that they could make him king. And then they staged a coup. They had Atalia caught and executed, and they placed Yoash on the throne. He was 7 years old, and he wasn't really, of course, he was still a child king. And the uncle Yehoyada, the Kohen Gadol, apparently ran the country for a while until Yoash grew up. Tragically, though, many years later, when Yehoyada HaKohen had finally passed away, and the people returned to idolatry, the idolatry that had been in place by his grandmother Atalia and had been removed by him and his uncle Yehoyada Kohen towards the end of his life. The idolatry returned. It's not clear whether he himself, Yoash, worshipped the idolatry, which it sort of sounds like from some of the psukim, or at the very least he tolerated it. And here's where we get to the incident of Zechariah. Zechariah ben Yehoyada, the son of that Kohen, as sort of if you want, the adopted brother, the stepbrother, if you want to think of it, not like, I guess, an adopted brother of the king Yoash. He was a Kohen. And it says here, Vayazvu et Beit Hashem Elokei Avotehem. They abandoned God and the message of the Beit HaMikdash. Vayavdu et ha'asherim v'atzabim, and they began to worship various idols. Vayihi ketzef al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim b'ashmatam zot. Vayishlach bahem neviim lashivam el Hashem, and God sent prophets to tell them, guys, you're going in the wrong direction again. You're going back to idolatry. Vaya'idu bam v'lo hazidu, and these prophets encouraged them, but it didn't work. The people didn't listen. And now the tragic event, which according to the rabbis took place on Yom Kippur. The Ruach Elohim lavshad Zechariah ben Yehoyada Kohen. This priest, this Kohen, Zechariah ben Yehoyada, who was himself the son of the Kohen, the previous Kohen Gadol, and was also, as we'll see in a minute, a Navi, a prophet. He was seized by the Spirit of God, Vayamod me'al la'am, and he stood up to rebuke the people, Vayomer lahem, and he said to them, Ko amara Elohim, I'm bringing you a message from God, I'm a Navi, I'm a prophet. Lama atem ovrim et mitzvat Hashem velo tatzlichu. Why are you once again making the mistake of abandoning God? It never works. Ki azavtem et Hashem vayazov etchem. If you abandon God, He's going to abandon you. Words that were echoed later by the later Nevi'im, by Yeshayahu and by Yirmiyahu, and which ultimately predicted the destruction that took place some 220-something years later. So he's standing up an earlier by Yikshiru alav. The people didn't like this. They lynched him basically. By Yikshiru alav, by Yirgemuhu even b'mitzvat hamelech. They took him out and they stoned him to death on the orders of the king Yoash. The king Yoash himself ordered the murder of his own stepbrother, the son of the people who saved his life and raised him. B'chatzar Beit Hashem, and this was done in the courtyard of the temple, right there in the Beit HaMikdash. This murder took place. Lo zachar Yoash hamelech hachesed asher asa Yehoyada aviv imo. And the king Yoash didn't remember all the kindness that had been done to him by the parents of this Zechariah, by Yaharoget Beno, and he had his son killed. Ukimoto. And as he was dying, Zechariah's final words were, Yereh Hashem v'yidrosh. May God see and avenge my blood. Wow. The rabbis saw in this tragic event, which again took place over 200 years before the destruction, long before Yirmiyahu was talking about the Molech in Gei Ben Hinnom, they saw in this the seeds of the destruction. There's a pasuk that we read last night in Eicha, which in the same pasuk mentions in Tochalna Nashim Piryam Olelei Tapuchim, women who were forced by hunger to eat their own children. Im Yehareg b'mikdash Hashem Kohen v'Navi, and priests and prophets that were killed in the mikdash of God. And this is something that Yirmiyahu Hanavi wailed about and mourned about in the book of Eicha. He warned about women who were driven to eat their own children and about Kohanim and Nevi'im that were killed in the Mikdash. But the rabbis read it a little differently. They said that when Yirmiyahu wasn't talking only about what took place during the final days in the destruction by the Babylonians, he was talking about, when he spoke about a priest and a prophet, a Kohen Vanavi, being killed in Mikdash Hashem, he was talking about the murder of Zechariah. We read a Kina this morning, which really, really like makes your hair stand on end if you understand it. We read a Kina this morning that lists all sorts of terrible things that happened at the time of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. Woe is unto me, woe is unto me, woe is unto me. And at the end of that Kina, after mourning all these horrific things that happened, there's a postscript. And the Paitan, the poet who wrote the Kina, puts in Veruach HaKodesh L'mulam Omrim. And then God's voice comes out, so to speak, and responds to them. And he says, what happened to them, they're willing to talk about. But what they did, they don't speak about. Im tochalna nashim piryam mashmi'im. They're willing to talk about it, to cry about the tragedy of a woman eating her own child because of the extreme hunger. But im yehareg b'mikdash Hashem kohen v'navi lo mashmi'im. But they don't talk about the things that they kohen that took place right here. That they don't talk about. There's a Gemara in Masechet Gittin that gives us the following midrashic story. I don't think this is meant to be history. This is a poetic image. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Avin, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Sachli zakein echad mi anshe Yerushalayim. I heard this from one of the elder people, one of the old men of Yerushalayim. Bivik'azo, in this valley, harag nevuzaran rav tabachim matayim v'chatasrei ribo. The rabbis like to speak in exaggerations. These numbers are just enormous. This old man said, in this valley, Nebuzaradan, the Babylonian general, slaughtered 210,000 people. Uvi Rishalayim. And in Jerusalem, Harag Tish'im v'arba'a ribo. Almost 1 million people, 940,000 on one stone. Ad shehalach daman, until their blood flowed. V'naga b'damav shel Zechariah. Until their blood touched the blood of Zechariah. What happened? Ashkeche ledame de Zechariah. This Nebuzaradan, this Babylonian general, Ashkeche ledamav de Zechariah. He burst into the Mikdash to destroy it. And when the enemy troops invaded the temple, they saw the blood of Zechariah. Again, we're talking about over 220 years after the murder took place. But according to this image, they saw the blood of Zechariah still on the ground in the Mikdash. Kamirtach, the blood of the murdered prophet, was boiling on the ground. A pool of boiling blood. And when Nebuzaradan saw that, he said, it looks strange to me. Amar, he said to them, Mayhai, what is this? And they didn't want to tell him the truth. So they said, Amrule dam zvachim dishtapuch. This is a temple. We sacrifice here. We slaughter a lot of animals. That's why there's boiling blood on the floor. Nebuzaradan wasn't stupid. He said, I don't believe you. Aitu dami v'lo idmu. He had them slaughter more animals, and he saw that it didn't do that. It didn't look the same. He said, I want you to tell me the truth. Amritu li mutav. If you tell me the truth, fine. V'ilav misarikna levisaraychu b'misarke deparzali. I'm going to torture you to death by scraping off your skin. You better tell me the truth. They had no choice. They told him, all right, we'll tell you the truth. What can we tell you? Neviya Havaban, there was this prophet among us, the Hava Kamuchachlan B'mile Dishmaya, this prophet among us who tried to rebuke us to return to the proper ways. Kamina Nilave, and it's been now many, many, many years, centuries actually, and his blood will not rest. We've tried to clean it up. We've tried to remove it. It won't go away. And we cannot remove the blood of Zechariah. And then he said, I'm going to make the blood come down, and talks about how he goes on, and he starts slaughtering Kohanim, and then he starts slaughtering children, and he slaughters and slaughters and slaughters Jews to atone for the death of Zechariah, and the blood won't stop boiling, and the blood won't stop boiling. And finally he screams at the blood, the enemy, and says, do you want me to kill everybody? And then the blood stopped. Zechariah's call for vengeance, which he had uttered as he was dying, an innocent victim a few hundred years earlier, finally stopped. And then it goes on and talks about how Nebuzaradan was so shaken by this that he went and gave up everything and became Jewish and converted. What are the rabbis trying to tell us with this story of the boiling blood? That the destruction that came here at the end of the first Beit HaMikdash started way back then when Zechariah was murdered. And just like we saw with Molech, we say the same thing here. A terribly unjust murder of an innocent person is connected to idolatry. So I think this is the first message here, and then we'll show one more video and we'll wrap it up. We have only another 10 minutes or so. But I think that in today's world, like I mentioned earlier, we understand morality when it comes to interpersonal relations. We understand murder, but theology seems to us to be something that really should be up to the individual. And the Torah seems to be trying to tell us here a slightly different message. Now, of course, religion can certainly be used for evil messages, for evil purposes. And belief in the true God can sometimes be twisted into murder. We talked earlier about people who believe in one God, the terrorists who scream Allahu Akbar. And it's not only Muslims, unfortunately, there have been Jews throughout history as well who misuse belief in God. And our Nevi'im spoke about that. We read about it on Shabbat. Yeshayahu Hanavi. Chazon Yeshayahu, this was his message. Yirmiyahu has the very same message as well. That if you think you can bring sacrifices and religious piety to God and pay him off while committing injustice against the widow and the poor and committing murder, God's not going to accept that. He doesn't want such sacrifices. Lama li rov zivchechem. That's not the God. That's the God of. That's when you start thinking of the one true God, like an idolater thinks of Molech. And then prophets said very clearly that religion without morality is worthless. First take care of the widow and the poor, and then come bring your sacrifices. But I think these sources are showing us the mirror image of that, which is that religion, faith in God without morality is meaningless. It's a perversion and a distortion. But ultimately, morality without faith in God, in the true God, also doesn't really work. When people are left to come up with their own ideologies, we've seen this in the 20th century, various ideologies that were developed, some religious ones like Islamic fundamentalism, but also atheist ideologies like Nazism and communism, and others that to this day are slaughtering people in the name of some ideology. Only when there's an understanding of one God who created the world, who ruled the world, and every single human being is a Tzelem Elokim, is created in the image of that God, only then can there be true morality. So idolatry ultimately leads, maybe not right away, but idolatry ultimately leads to murder. You see it here with the murder of Zechariah, which the rabbis saw as the beginnings of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And you see it later on with people murdering babies in the worship of Molech. I want to show one more video. We're going to walk just a few steps from where we were and see Yad Avshalom, and we'll say a few words about that. And with that, we will wrap up. Behind me is probably the most impressive of the large monumental tombs found here in Emek HaMelech. This is known as Yad Avshalom. Traditionally, this is known as by the name Yad Avshalom, which is a name that comes from a pasuk. Avshalom was the son of David HaMelech. We may remember the story that when David was king here in Yerushalayim, his son Avshalom rebelled against him, came with an army to try to attack Yerushalayim. David evacuated Yerushalayim, actually left right here through Nachal Kidron, ran up this way, retreating so that he wouldn't have to fight a battle in Yerushalayim. Avshalom took over the city of Yerushalayim. David went all the way out to Ever HaYarden, to the other side of the Jordan River. Later, Avshalom's army came to attack David. There was a battle, and eventually Avshalom was killed in that battle by Yoav ben Tzruya, David's general. And the Navi tells us the following. So Avshalom was killed in a place called Yar Ephraim, way north of here. But the Pasuk in Shmuel Bet tells us, Shmuel Bet, Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Yudchet, V'Avshalom lakach vayatzev lo v'chayav. When Avshalom had been still alive, he built in his lifetime et matzevet asher be'emek hamelech. He built a matzeva. He built a monument for himself in Emek HaMelech. Ki amar, ein li ben. He said, I have no sons, I have no children to carry after me. Bavur hazkir shmi. Vayikra lamatzevet al shmo. Vayikare la yad Avshalom ad hayom hazeh. The Pasuk tells us that Avshalom had wanted to be remembered, so he built a monumental tomb for himself, or a monument for himself, in Emek HaMelech. And we've already explained that this area is known as Emek HaMelech. And he called it Yad Avshalom, the monument to Avshalom. And according to the book of Shmuel, he was killed far away from here, buried over there. It's not clear whether he even had the privilege of being buried in this place that he had built to remember himself, because he was such an evil person, a child who rebelled against his father. And according to tradition, this is Yad Avshalom. In fact, in the 19th century, a custom developed here in Yerushalayim, a custom that developed among the Jews and Muslims alike. When a young boy was around the age of bar mitzvah, his father would take him by the hand and bring him outside the city one day, and they would come down to Yad Avshalom, and he would say, this is what happens to a child who doesn't listen to his parents, and the father and son would take stones and throw it to stone the tomb to show how bad it is to rebel against your father and how important it is to respect your parents. Jewish parents used to do this with their sons. Muslim parents from Yerushalayim used to do this with their sons. And in fact, when researchers came here to research this tomb in the 19th century, they found a huge pile of stones from those who came to stone the tomb of Avshalom ben David. There's only one problem. Just like we spoke about before with Kever Zechariah, this cannot possibly be a tomb from the time of Avshalom ben David. Avshalom is 200 years or so before Zechariah, and this is very, very clearly a classical style. Those familiar with classical architecture will see there something in the shape of Ionic capitals on top of the pillars. There's a Doric frieze on top of that, and at the top there's a nefesh of the type that we spoke about before. This is absolutely a style that comes from the end of the second Beit HaMikdash. Actually, archaeologists have dated it even to the 1st century CE, very shortly before the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. And unlike what's called Kever Zechariah down there, this is an actual tomb. The bottom part is carved into the actual mountain, just like the monument we saw before. You can see that there's a hole in the front, which was made later on in history in the Byzantine period, but there actually is a burial cave inside there, and the nefesh at the top is mounted on top of that. So unlike in the case of Kever Zechariah, where I can suggest that perhaps maybe the tradition is accurate, in this case I can tell you with almost absolute certainty that this is not Yad Avshalom. Somebody's buried in there, or was buried in there, and it's not Avshalom ben David. It's somebody who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, 1,000 years after Avshalom ben David. Where is the real Yad Avshalom, or where was it? I don't know. And who's buried here? I also don't know. But I just want to share one really, really incredible irony. I talked about those magnificent structures with the pyramid at the top called a nefesh. The rabbis in the Talmud, or in the Mishnah actually, had a very, very ambivalent attitude towards these structures. They didn't prohibit them. People did this, wealthy people did this as a way to memorialize those who died. But the rabbis said, Ein osin nefashot latzadikim. This is a Tosefta that's quoted in the Yerushalmi Masechet Bikurim. Ein osin nefashot latzadikim. Really righteous people, we don't need to make these monuments with his nefesh at the top for them. Divreihem hein zichronam. A righteous person's real legacy is not a huge monument made out of stone, but what he said, what he did in this world is his real legacy. So ein osin nefashot latzadikim. You can build it if you want,
But for a real righteous person, it's not the stone monument that matters. It's the legacy that the person leaves behind. And look at the irony. Somebody, we don't know who, but somebody who may have been a wonderful person, spent a lot of time and money to build this magnificent structure so that he would be remembered. And whoever he was has been forgotten. And instead his grave became known as the Great Vav Shalom. And perhaps not due to any fault of his, but it became a site that fathers used to take their children to come and throw rocks at it so that they could curse the memory of Avshalom ben David. Whoever actually is buried here was forgotten. So these tombs that are here from the Second Temple period were built by people who had a certain desire to be remembered, and the legacy they left behind is perhaps something else entirely.
Okay, very quickly, because we really only have just a few minutes left. So that's not Yad Avshalom, but Yad Avshalom is somewhere near here, and it gives us the opportunity to talk about Avshalom. Avshalom rebelled against his father David, and the Navi tells us very, very clearly that this was actually a punishment for David with his sin that he committed with Bathsheba and Uriah. Madua, this is the prophet Natan talking to David. Madua bazita dvar Hashem lasot hara beinai, and it talks about what he did, and it says in the last pasuk there, Ko amar Hashem hineni mekim alecha ra'a mi beitecha v'lakachti et nashecha le'enecha, etc., that all sorts of troubles are going to come from within your own family. This is the punishment for this sin. Now, according to the simple reading, at least of the story, very, very briefly, because I only have like 3 or 4 minutes here. And I assume many people are familiar, but what the Navi actually tells us is that David had one of his top soldiers whose name was Uriah HaChiti, who also lived in Yerushalayim. And Uriah was off in battle against Ammon, and the army was at war, and David was back in Yerushalayim, and David noticed his wife, Bathsheba, who was very beautiful, and he summoned her to the palace and committed adultery with her, and she became pregnant from that. And in what appears to be an attempt to cover it up, he has Uriah come back, and he wanted sort of to create an alibi, and Uriah didn't seem to cooperate. And eventually he arranged to have Uriah killed in battle, and eventually he winds up marrying Bathsheba, who actually becomes the mother of Shlomo HaMelech and of ultimately the ancestor of the Mashiach. There's a lot to be said about that story, and this is not the time. I will comment that there are opinions in the rabbis that seem to try to mitigate David's sin. Contrary to simple reading, they do not try to say that David did not sin. He absolutely sinned, but suggest that it wasn't exactly adultery, perhaps it wasn't exactly murder, perhaps Uriah bore some responsibility for it. And what the rabbis, on the one hand, I think were trying to tell us is that David HaMelech was a great man. This shouldn't be written off as a simple politician sex scandal or something like that. At the same time, though, it's a mistake to try to whitewash this. David HaMelech was the last person to do that. He accepted full responsibility, and that's what makes David great. And again, that's a different, perhaps worthy of a discussion a few weeks from now in the month of Elul and Tshuva, not for now. But in any case, we see here now, if we saw already connections between idolatry and murder, so now we see a connection between adultery and murder. And these things also happen, unfortunately, today as well. So perhaps we can just wrap up with the Gemara with which we started. The rabbi spoke about Avodah Zarah, Giloy Arayot, and Shfichut Damim, 3 of these horrific sins. We talked about how even if we understand Shfichut Damim today, perhaps it's harder for us to relate to Avodah Zarah and Giloy Arayot as being sins. When we've seen here, perhaps some of how those things, idolatry and adultery, more quickly than people think, ultimately degenerate into murder. And so the 3 are really, really connected. And perhaps we also got to see a little bit about how it starts off with something else. The people didn't intend to sink to this level. They had higher ideas. They thought they were worshiping some god or whatever it is, David. When you step over the line, things can degenerate. So I think that's the lesson of those first 3 sins. And maybe I'll say just one sentence about Sinat Chinam. is for another time. But when the rabbis were speaking about sinat chinam, baseless hatred, they also weren't talking about just people being vindictive to one another or people slandering one another for no good reason. The rabbis, I don't have time to go into this and to demonstrate it now, but the rabbis were talking about political debates, ideological debates of the most important matters that people tragically, because they cared so deeply about what they believed, and they were so convinced that the other side was wrong, this led to a lot of fighting and ultimately to bloodshed. So there's actually a connection between what the rabbis here were saying about the sins of Bayit Rishon and the sins of Bayit Sheni, that things that start off sort of with a minor offense on something that maybe even well-intentioned can degenerate very quickly into the most horrific things. And I think there's a lot of lessons for us. It's these sins that brought about the destruction, and these are the things that we need to correct in these final moments of Tisha B'Av. May we learn these lessons, and may we take the steps necessary to correct both the severe flaws and the more subtle ones, so that next year on Tisha B'Av, Bezrat Hashem, we will be celebrating in the rebuilt Beit HaMikdash. Bezrat Hashem. Thank you very much.